Hi folks, Kathy Brooks here, back in Vegas at the Hydrant Club for this week's Canine Linguistics class. Good to see you all. And I've got a little, peanut gallery over here right now. So today I want to talk about something really interesting. If I need legal advice, I'm probably not going to ask it on Facebook. Just because someone has worked with a lawyer or took a law class in college or watches a lot of legal dramas doesn't make them qualified to answer legal questions. Just because my next door neighbor works on their car doesn't necessarily mean that they're the person to figure out the catalytic converter issue in my Prius. If I had a Prius, which I don't. Just because I have a child doesn't mean that I would be a great teacher for a school. Just because someone has a dog or has had a dog doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best place you should go for advice. I mean, look, let's be honest. There are 1,000,001 resources online. You can talk to any doctor and they say that one of the greatest detriments to their ability to build a forge a relationship with a patient these days, is Dr. Google. People Googling symptoms and things that they have and thinking that their Google search has somehow made them better and smarter than their physician. And I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't do research. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't avail ourselves of books, of videos, of information from people online. Of course we should, but it's really important that you evaluate the source of that information before taking it as gospel. So there are a lot of people online who have a lot of credentials. Many of which can be secured by paying a fee, taking a quick online test, and having no real world experience necessarily whatsoever. I know lots of people in my line of work who have all kinds of initials after their name, who I wouldn't actually entrust with my dogs. So what does that mean? Caveat emptor, which is Latin for buyer beware. You need to make sure that you're being smart about your experience. And when you post a question on Facebook asking your friends for advice, just because friends have had dogs doesn't necessarily mean that they have a lot of data. They have the experience with their dog. They don't have an experience with a body of dogs over a period of time. I'm also very, very leery of experts, so-called experts, who are so wedded to their very particular methodology that they're not willing to think that another methodology, technique, or tool would be useful. My personal belief as an educator is that I must have a very broad toolbox. I must have knowledge, working knowledge, in-depth knowledge, and at least passing knowledge of many different kinds of techniques and methodologies. Now, there will be some that just don't resonate for me. There will be some that is utilized for work that I don't necessarily do. So that's where I have my passing knowledge. So like Schutzen work, which is a sporting training that involves bite work, so bite and protection, obedience, as well as agility. And people typically compete in it. I don't have any personal experience with it whatsoever. I know the basic workings of it. I know the basic mechanisms of it. I know the elements of it. I haven't personally done it. It's not work that I do. Could I do it? Sure. Might I do it one day and add it to my repertoire? Maybe. But it's not methodology that I work with. I'm personally not a clicker trainer. I don't believe, from a behavioral stabilization perspective, I don't believe that operant conditioning is an effective way to get a dog's behavior to stabilize. It's excellent if you're teaching a dog a task. If you're doing specific work that has to have an immediate reward connotation to an action that a dog takes, clicker and a treat reward might be useful in that scenario. Again, not the kind of work I do. The work that I do is behavioral stabilization, basic to intermediate obedience, and I've just become certified in the Keeler method of dog training, which is a kind of a very focused training specifically looking at off-leash work. And I've been doing some obedience trial training under the Keeler method as well of late. All of this is to say, I have lots of tools in my toolbox. Some of those are literal tools from gentle leaders and some harnesses, which actually aren't training mechanisms at all. They're kind of mitigation tools. But I have them in there as a kind of an easy step for some people, clients who might need something of a transition from one tool to another. I have an array of choke chains in various weights and lengths. I have various pinch collars in various weights and lengths. I have remote training collars that are used in very specific scenarios for very specific behaviors that have 3 levels. They're super, super simple collars that have 3 basic functions: sound, vibration, and stimulation with 15 levels of each. There's 3 buttons on the remote. It's super easy to teach people. The remote collar is a very powerful tool to use for a lot of different things. You can use it to proof or extinguish negative behavior in a dog. You can use it to guide a dog, especially when that dog is at a distance to you. So it can be a very valuable tool. It is not for every dog. It is not for every situation. And it has to be socialized to the dog very, very carefully. You don't just slap it on the dog and start using it. You actually have to have the dog wear it without it being turned on for a couple of days, not 24-hour periods, but put it on in the morning, take it off at night. Do that for a couple of days, and then work with the dog in a non-stimulated environment, so there's no adrenaline levels to combat. And then finally, you use it in the heightened energy scenario. But that takes time, that takes patience, and it takes nuance. It is not, the remote collar is not a binary tool that you just put on and try to control a dog. The thing that I'm always leery of when I'm watching different people's videos online, and they're talking about controlling a dog. Let's get something clear. There isn't any amount of behavioral work that a decent, reliable, acceptable, reputable educator would use that is under the precept of controlling a dog's behavior. We don't control living creatures. What we do is we set rules, boundaries, and set expectations. And yes, you can set expectations for your dog, much like you set expectations for a pre-verbal toddler. You have to set them simply, firmly, and you don't expect them to have deep cognitive reasoning or deductive reasoning capabilities at that age. And so with a dog, I have an expectation once I've shown the dog what the word sit means, what that sound coming out of my mouth is identified with a certain action. Once the dog understands that, then I have an expectation that when I say it, that they will do it. And if they don't, I need to take an action that will move the dog into the correct behavior. So it is a corrective measure. Where I really have concern about some of the methodologies that I am seeing, especially the ones that are being promoted very widely, are things called fear-free or force-free training. These are code words for purely positive reinforcement training. Let's get something very clear. There isn't any species like a dog, or even a human for that matter, where purely positive reinforcement is successful. There needs to be consequence. I mean, the consequence for not following the rules needs to be appropriate. It needs to be commensurate with whatever the infraction or the broken rule is. But there needs to be a consequence. I was down at a place called Crissy Field in San Francisco the other day, watching a series of different dog care professionals. There were, a couple of people who had just 2 or 3 dogs. There were a couple, however, who had anywhere from 10 to 15 dogs, which, by the way, in an environment like that is just too many dogs for one person to be handling. I don't care how good you are. The space is too wide. There are too many external factors. So, I'm watching these different groups of dog handlers and watching the vastly different series of techniques. So there was one technique in particular that was very troubling to me. It was one dog walker. She had 9 dogs with her, might have been 10, one of which was a very reactive miniature doodle of some sort. Dog was probably about yay big, maybe 15, 16 pounds, if an ounce. And the dog was extremely reactive to the other dogs going by. So the dog had a leash dragging from its harness, and the dog was charging at and really not taking the signals from another dog. One of the dogs that this small dog decided to go after was a rather large-sized male Rhodesian Ridgeback. The dog had to be 110, 120 pounds. He was magnificent. He was beautiful, just trotting along quietly next to its human. And this small dog went charging at the dog, and the Ridgeback, in very appropriate fashion, kind of sidestepped. You could see his lip curl. You could hear a long, low growl. Very, very appropriate, leave me alone, kid. And this small dog didn't take that boundary, didn't honor that boundary. The dog walker at that point starts calling to the dog in an incredibly high-pitched voice. I don't even think that I could emulate it, which is a good thing, because it was like broken glass on one's ears. Screaming and squealing the dog's name up and down in a kind of a cascading sound, and repeating the pattern over and over. The dog finally, after being kind of kicked away by the Ridgeback's owner, and the Ridgeback, to its credit, just kind of backed away. The owner intervened and kind of moved the dog away, and she went away with her dog. At that point, this walker is screaming and screaming. The dog finally turns and comes back, and what does she do? She gives the dog a treat. Now, what she's just done in that moment is reinforce all of that bad behavior. What she needed to do, first of all, was be right up with that dog so that she could apply an appropriate corrective measure. This also would have been a great scenario where, if she couldn't be right with the dog, a remote training collar on that dog would have allowed her from 30 feet away to apply an appropriate corrective measure to tell that dog no. So it was appalling to me, because here is someone who's a dog care professional, who's out tending to the care of people's dogs in the public, and her awareness, her education was clearly lacking, her awareness of dog behavior clearly lacking, and it could have resulted in a very, very a catastrophic situation for that smaller dog, were that Ridgeback not to have been as well balanced and well mannered as it was. And I'm sure these people did some research to find the walker. She probably had a bunch of 5 stars on Yelp or what have you. And so, when you're asking people's advice, it's important, first of all, that you be prepared to hear something that you don't want to hear. I always tell people, don't ask my opinion if you don't want me to tell you the truth, or you don't want to hear what I have to say, because I'm going to tell you the truth, and sometimes it might be a little uncomfortable. I'm listening and reading a book right now on a completely non-dog related topic, but one of the issues that it is laying out is how people don't like to sit in discomfort. They're not okay being wrong. They don't want to feel wrong, and there's this attachment that people have to feeling like they know. What I always try to encourage people is, look, if you're engaging a dog care professional, an education professional with your dog, you're not expected to know everything. You shouldn't know everything. And you know what? There's probably things that you're doing wrong that you don't mean to be, But that's okay. You're not a dog care professional. That's why you call somebody and reach out to someone for help, because they have the knowledge. So when you're looking for a care professional to help, look at what that person's background is like. And it doesn't necessarily mean they went to this training academy or that training academy. Those things are nice. They're kind of nice to haves, but they're not necessarily the justification for whether that person really knows what they're talking about. What you really want to look at, first of all, is how long has this individual been working with dogs? How long have they been doing it successfully? What kinds of things do the people who have been working with them say about their work? I feel pretty confident that if you were to ask the people who have worked with me over the years, they'll tell you that I'm very straightforward, sometimes to a fault. I don't candy coat things. I have learned over the years to soften some of the delivery, but at the end of the day, the thing that matters most to me is the safety, well-being, and happy life of the dog. And sometimes that means that we as humans have to be made a little bit uncomfortable. We have to look at our own behavior. We have to look at the way we anthropomorphize our dogs. They are not furry people. I'll say that slowly one more time. Our dogs are not our fur babies. They are not furry people. They are our beloved family members of a completely different species that sees the world differently than we do, communicates differently than we do, has different needs than we do, and does not have the same behaviors and emotions than we do. There's similarities, which is where things get a little confusing, but anthropomorphizing a dog is probably the worst possible thing that we can do for our dog's well-being and safety. This isn't about coddling the dog. This is about drawing some boundaries. And if you have a breed that's particularly dominant or particularly headstrong, it is exponentially more important that you lay those boundaries very, very early, and you put those rules in place really, really early, because otherwise you'll have a dog that is just going to be a dog. And ultimately, that dog's behavior could lead it to doing something that will get it in trouble. And depending on what that behavior is, it could end up in trouble for you too. So things like a dog jumping and knocking someone down not only will result in the dog being possibly reported as an aggressive dog, but could end you up in court if the person who fell down got hurt. So it's really important that you think about, it's when I ask the advice for dog behavior, I shouldn't keep asking until I hear what it is I want to hear, because that's not going to serve the dog any good at all. I will often, go online and I will see, people who are asking questions online about, advice about dog behavior. I will sometimes, reach out to them privately and ask if they're interested in a professional's perspective. Some people say yes. Other people say no. Some people say yes, and then they don't like what I say. So be it. But at the end of the day, if that dog misbehaves, it's the human's fault when that happens. So that's the broad brushstroke of what I wanted to discuss today. Just because it's very present on my mind, I have had a few people ask me lately for some advice and then decide that they didn't want to listen to it, which is fine. It's people's prerogative to take advice or not take it. It's just a little frightening for me when I see the way that people are looking to unskilled, non-professionals online, and then taking that advice and implementing it with their dogs. The rise of stories of dogs being having to be put down because they have mauled a neighbor's child, or even worse, have killed a child. The stories are rising in frequency because there are more dogs in people's homes than ever before. There's an overpopulation of dogs. There's overbreeding of dogs. This is my little plug for, if you can adopt rather than shop, please do. There are good breeders out there who are being responsible. Not all of them, many of them, when you look at the cost benefit analysis of breeding, in order to make their numbers, they have to breed a lot, which is typically not a great thing for the dogs, nor does it typically result in good behavior for the dogs. So it's important to think about that as you are moving forward. Not only, where do you get your dog from and what behavior are you dealing with, but what resources are you going to need? Knowing what a dog was made for can also help guide you to the right kind of trainer. I'll give you an example. I had someone call me and they had adopted a dog that they found out was 7/8 Malinois, 1/8 German Shepherd. And I said, look, I would love to work with you, but I personally believe that dog probably needs to be doing some sporting work. You might want to be doing some nose work, which I don't presently do here at the Hydrant Club. You might want to do some Schutzhund training with that dog, do some bite work with the dog, really fuel that dog for kind of what they were made for. And so that's what the individual did. And he called me about a week later and said, well, my dog failed Schutzhund. He has no drive. We couldn't get him to bite. And, so the dog is a unicorn. This dog is very much an anomaly for the breed. He is not a normal Malinois. A typical Malinois shouldn't be in a play group, should not be around small dogs, should be doing a lot of focused bite and protection work, a lot of agility work. And this dog has a very busy brain, so you need to keep him busy, but he's definitely doesn't have that drive. So like I said, he is an outlier case for the breed. So he actually does come here now. And so, thinking about that as you're venturing into doing work with your dog, that's really important. Making sure that you are feeding the dog's way of thinking, will lead you to a solution that will be a happier, healthier solution for you and your dog. So to recap, don't ask advice on your social networks about dog behavior. Just don't. We all know why we post on social media. We do it to have people co-sign our bullshit and tell us what we want to hear. We're all guilty of it. I post about something that happens to me, someone who did something to me, because what I'm looking for is people to tell me that I'm awesome, the other person is an asshole, and I'm absolutely right. We all do it. We're all guilty. So when I'm posting a question, what I'm probably secretly looking for is somebody to co-sign what I already believe. If you're really looking for a true answer, seek the answer from somebody with experience, whether that is a professional dog educator, whether that is a dog behavior group. There are plenty of those, whether that is the dog care facility where you may go with your dog for either daycare or day school or for boarding. These are all options that you have. People who have been working with dogs, large numbers of dogs, so they have a lot more anecdotal, and some of them may even have data to back up some of their ideas. So that's the first thing, is thinking about your source. Don't use your Google search as your sole source. You may get lucky, but it is just that, luck, and luck does and can run out. Once you identify where your reasonable resources are, you really want to think about talking as an engaged student with that teacher. You know your dog better than anybody else ever could. Even a trained professional is never going to know your dog as intimately as you do. That's why it needs to be a partnership. You need to be able to have an open conversation, and you also need to be very, very willing for that person to tell you something you don't want to hear. One of the pieces of advice I give people more than anything else is get the dog out of bed with you. You're having behavioral issues with your dog's pulling on the leash, jumping on the door on people when they come through the front door. The last thing they should be doing is sleeping in an elevated position in the home at a peer level with its humans. Now, does that mean the dog never sleeps in the bed with you? I don't, that's not something that can be said. I personally, of my 3 dogs, 2 of them more often than not sleep in bed with me. But not always. Sometimes one of them does and the other doesn't. Sometimes I rotate that. Sometimes neither of them do. Sometimes they both do. They're both, if they are in bed with me, they are in their separate space. They're not up in my space, so they can cohabitate the space, but they get out of bed when I tell them to. It's about being able to have that control. If I had even one dog in my house where the behavior was unstable to the point that having any dogs in the bed would lead to more destabilization in that dog, then you know what? None of the dogs would be in bed with me at any point in time. So we need to think about the little things that we do, the behaviors that we have, and be willing to make the changes we need to make in the short term for the long-term gain of the relationship with our dog. And that's the third and final piece of advice that I would have for you. Once you've identified an accurate, reputable, reliable resource, you've done enough of your own research about the dog breed, and the behaviors that you can be an active participant with that resource to address the issues. Then the third thing that you need to do is be prepared to be uncomfortable. Be prepared to admit that what you're doing isn't working. Be prepared to change your behavior and willing to change your behavior, even if it's just for a short period of time, but commit to doing it for enough of a period of time that you give your dog an opportunity to learn and for that behavior to stabilize. So those are my little tidbits for you today. I am going to now go spend some time with my children. We're being very, very good and very, very patient. Until next week, this has been Kathy Brooks for Canine Linguistics from the Hydrant Club. Thanks for tuning in.